Imagine a machine forged in the furnace of human conflict, built to dominate the skies and crush the will of nations, and yet, over time, transformed into something far greater. Not merely an aircraft, not merely a weapon, but a symbol of endurance itself. Born in an age of uncertainty, raised in the smoke of war, and remembered as the plane that simply refused to die. This is the story of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, an icon of strength, sacrifice, and survival. In the early 1930s, the clouds of war were gathering once again over the world. The Great War had ended barely a decade earlier, but the peace that followed was fragile and temporary. Across the oceans, new powers were rising, testing boundaries, rebuilding armies. Germany was rearming in secret. Japan was expanding across Asia. The world's militaries watched with a mixture of fear and fascination as technology changed faster than ever before. Airplanes, once fragile novelties, had become machines of power, extensions of strategy, tools of terror, and symbols of national pride. In the United States, the Army Air Corps dreamed of something bold. They wanted a bomber that could fly farther than any before, carry more explosives, and survive in the most hostile skies imaginable. Most aircraft designers thought it was impossible. But at Boeing's facilities in Seattle, a small team of engineers decided to prove the world wrong. Led by E. Gifford Emery and Edward Curtis Wells, Boeing's engineers began working on a secret project known only as Model 299. The vision was ambitious, a heavy, four-engine bomber capable of crossing oceans, flying at altitudes where fighters struggled to reach, and defending itself with an arsenal of machine guns. It was a bet on the future, a gamble that air power would decide the next war. When the prototype was finally unveiled, it stunned the military observers who came to see it. It was sleek, yet massive, bristling with armament, more than a dozen 50-caliber guns mounted across its frame. Its aluminum skin gleamed under the Seattle sun, and its wings stretched wider than anything the Army had flown before. One reporter, overwhelmed by its sheer presence, called it a flying fortress. Boeing seized upon the name immediately, filing it as a trademark. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a prophecy. On July 28, 1935, the Model 299 took off for its maiden flight. The four Wright Cyclone engines roared to life, lifting the massive frame into the air. It climbed smoothly, gracefully, reaching speeds and altitudes that seemed almost impossible. The press called it a miracle of the modern age. The U.S. Army Air Corps saw its future, but fate had other plans. Just a few months later, during a demonstration at Wright Field in Ohio, tragedy struck. The prototype, flown by an experienced test pilot, stalled during takeoff and crashed, killing both pilots on board. For a moment, it seemed that the dream of the Flying Fortress had died before it began. Critics dismissed it as too complex, too heavy, too ambitious, but Boeing refused to let it end there. Engineers went back to the drawing board, addressing every flaw, every weakness. They improved the control systems, redesigned the stabilizers, and made it easier to handle. They added safety mechanisms and simplified the takeoff process. By the time production began in 1937, the Flying Fortress had evolved into a machine unlike anything else in the world. It could carry 5,000 pounds of bombs, reach altitudes above 30,000 feet, and defend itself from every direction. When war finally erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States remained officially neutral, but the Flying Fortress was already preparing for its destiny. By the time America entered the conflict in 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, hundreds of B-17s were ready to take flight. And the world was about to witness what they could do. The skies over Europe in 1942 were chaos incarnate. The Luftwaffe ruled with brutal efficiency. Allied planes fell like rain, But then came the fortresses, flying in tight formations, silver wings glinting in the sun, engines roaring in unison like a storm of steel. The Germans called them Viermotorige Teufel, four-engined devils. The B-17s were designed for daylight precision bombing. That meant they flew straight into danger, no cover of night, no room for error. They struck at the heart of German industry, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, rail yards, weapon factories. Each mission could last 10 hours or more. The crews endured freezing temperatures, oxygen deprivation, and the constant terror of flak, black puffs of smoke that tore through the air with deadly shrapnel. Inside the fuselage, 10 men performed a deadly dance of coordination. The pilot and co-pilot fought the turbulence. The navigator charted invisible paths through enemy airspace. The bombardier watched through the glass nose, guiding the payload to its target. Machine gunners spun in every direction, searching the skies for fighters. The air was so cold that gun barrels froze, so loud that speech was useless. Every vibration of the engines was a heartbeat. Every mile closer to the target was a brush with death, and yet the Flying Fortress earned its name. Time after time, planes came home riddled with holes, missing chunks of wing or tail, but still flying. Ground crews would stare in disbelief as fortresses landed on 3 engines or 2, or sometimes 1. They saw bombers come back with fuselages torn open like wounds, engines leaking fire, landing gear jammed, windows shattered. The pilots, trembling, would step out onto the tarmac, covered in frost, their faces pale but alive. They'd look back at their plane and whisper, "She brought us home." The stories spread quickly. The myth of the indestructible bomber became morale fuel. Newspapers called it the plane that could not be killed. One B-17 returned from a mission with more than 1,000 bullet holes. Another had its tail nearly blown off, but still managed to land safely. One famous photograph captured a fortress with an entire section of its rear fuselage missing. Its tail barely attached by metal strips, and yet it flew over 300 miles to reach base. Among the countless tales of courage and survival, one stands out above all, the story of the All-American. In February 1943, during a mission over Tunisia, the B-17 named All-American collided mid-air with a German Messerschmitt. The fighter's wings sliced through the fortress's tail, leaving a gaping hole that seemed impossible to overcome. But the pilot and his crew refused to give up. They used trim tabs, power adjustments, and sheer willpower to keep the aircraft steady. For hours, they fought gravity and chaos, limping home with the sky visible through their torn fuselage. When they finally landed, the ground crews stood in stunned silence. The plane was nearly split in two, and yet it had made it back. To the men who flew her, the Flying Fortress was more than metal and engines. She was alive. They spoke to her before takeoff, patted her fuselage for luck, and cursed her lovingly when she shuddered through turbulence. They called her Old Girl, Sweetheart, Angel of Mercy, and in return she kept them alive more times than they could count. The bond between man and machine grew into something sacred. Crews decorated their planes with names, nose art, and pin-up girls, symbols of home, love, and luck. Each fortress became a reflection of its crew's identity. There was Memphis Belle, 909, Shoo Shoo Baby, Heavenly Body. Each name carried stories of laughter and fear, loss and triumph. When one went down, it was like losing a friend. By 1943, the B-17 was the spearhead of America's campaign over Europe. The bombing missions over Germany became both legendary and tragic. In October of that year, the 8th Air Force launched a raid over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, targets vital to the German war machine. It was one of the most dangerous missions of the war. 60 bombers were lost in a single day. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured, but the factories were destroyed and Germany's ball-bearing production crippled. It was victory bought with blood, and the Flying Fortress became the symbol of that price. As the war dragged on, new bombers like the B-24 Liberator and later the B-29 Superfortress joined the fight. But none captured the world's imagination quite like the B-17. It was not the fastest or the most advanced. It was not even the most efficient. But it was the most human. It was a plane that taught the world something about survival, not just in war, but in life. The Flying Fortress was not designed to be immortal, and yet somehow she was. By late 1943, the skies over Europe had become an unending battlefield. The deep blue above the clouds was beautiful but deadly, and every bomber crew knew that somewhere ahead the sky would turn black with flak and smoke. The Flying Fortress formations stretched for miles, 1,000 silver birds glinting in the morning light. From the ground, they looked like slow-moving constellations, majestic, unstoppable. But inside each aircraft, fear was constant. The hum of the engines wasn't comforting. It was the sound of uncertainty, of fate ticking forward. At 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. The metal of the aircraft froze. Oxygen masks stiffened, and exposed skin could turn white in seconds. The gunners' fingers were wrapped in layers of cloth, but frost still bit through. Every breath was painful, every word muffled by the roar of the engines. The world outside was silent and vast, until the first black clouds of flak began to bloom. Flak, those terrible bursts of shrapnel that exploded in patterns designed to tear wings apart. The Germans filled the skies with it. The men could see it. It was like flying into the mouth of death, knowing you could do nothing to avoid it. When flak hit, the sound was like a hammer striking the hull, followed by the screams of tearing metal. Holes appeared in the wings, the fuselage, the cockpit. Sometimes men vanished mid-sentence, ripped away by invisible blades. And still, the fortresses kept flying straight, because to turn back meant to die alone. Only together could they hope to survive. Fighter attacks were even worse. The Luftwaffe learned quickly how to exploit the B-17's weaknesses. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dove out of the sun, spitting cannon shells that shredded aluminum and bone alike. The fortress fought back with up to 13 machine guns, but the odds were brutal. A bomber formation was a dance of death, every man firing, shouting, praying. The sound of 50 caliber rounds echoed through the frozen air, tracers streaking like fireflies through the sky. Some planes went up in flames. Others fell silently, tumbling through the clouds like broken birds. Inside the chaos, there were moments of unimaginable courage. There were gunners who stayed at their posts even after being wounded, still firing until their hands could no longer move. There were pilots who refused to bail out, guiding crippled aircraft home so their crews could survive. There were medics improvising first aid in the air, pressing rags into wounds while the plane shook violently. It was mechanical hell, and yet somehow it brought out the very best of humanity. The fortress became more than a machine of war. It became a crucible of brotherhood. Every mission blurred the line between man and metal. The crew learned to feel every vibration, every shift in the tone of the engines. A pilot could tell if one engine was faltering just by the sound in his bones. They knew their plane's quirks, its voice, its heartbeat. They said the B-17 wasn't just flown, it was felt. There were superstitions too. Crews carried lucky charms, photographs of sweethearts, pieces of shrapnel turned into talismans. Some painted their aircraft with pin-up girls, others with grim reapers or angels, names like Hell's Kitchen, The Beast, or Heaven Can Wait. The art was more than decoration, it was defiance. A way of saying, we're still here. Every fortress had a story. Some were stories of triumph, others of heartbreak. In one mission over Bremen, a B-17 named Old 666 took more than 200 hits from enemy fire. Both pilots were wounded, the radio destroyed, oxygen lines severed. And yet, the aircraft limped home on two engines, guided by sheer determination. When it landed, the ground crew counted the holes, 271. It should have been impossible. But the B-17 made the impossible routine. Psychologists studying bomber crews during the war found something extraordinary. Despite the extreme conditions, despite the staggering casualty rates, morale among B-17 crews remained higher than almost any other branch of service. They attributed it not only to training or patriotism, but to faith in their aircraft. The men believed that if any plane could bring them back alive, it was the Fortress. That belief became a weapon in itself, but belief didn't stop the losses. By mid-1944, tens of thousands of men had died in the air war over Europe. The 8th Air Force alone suffered more than 26,000 killed, more than the entire U.S. Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. Every new mission felt like gambling with the sky. And yet, when the call came, the fortresses rose again. They bombed Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne. They leveled rail lines, fuel depots, and armament factories. Slowly, painfully, they began to break the German war machine. The sky was their battlefield, and every victory came at a cost measured in lives. By this time, the legend of the Flying Fortress had spread far beyond the war zones. Newspapers printed stories of miraculous returns, of men who survived falls from 20,000 feet, of crews rescued after crash landing in the Channel. The B-17 became a symbol of American resilience, a machine that mirrored the stubbornness of the nation itself. But even symbols bleed. The physical toll on the men was immense. Sleep deprivation, constant fear, and exposure to freezing air took their toll. Many came home with trembling hands and thousand-yard stares. Some never truly came home at all. The Air Force called it combat fatigue. Today we know it as trauma. The Flying Fortress gave them survival, but survival had a price. When D-Day arrived in June 1944, the B-17s played a crucial role in softening German defenses along the French coast. They flew in waves so large that the sky darkened with their shadows. Pilots reported seeing other formations stretching endlessly ahead, a vision both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It felt as if the heavens themselves were at war. After D-Day, the tide turned. The Allies advanced across Europe, and the air war shifted to destroying what remained of Germany's industry. The fortresses targeted oil fields, bridges, and railways. The end was coming, but not without more sacrifice. In one of the final major raids, hundreds of fortresses attacked the city of Dresden. The results were catastrophic. The moral weight of such missions would haunt many of the men for decades. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the skies fell silent. The fortresses returned to their bases, engines cooling, wings scarred, paint scorched. For the men who had flown them, it was like saying goodbye to a part of themselves. They had lived inside those machines, trusted them, depended on them, and now their purpose was over. Some airmen cried when their planes were decommissioned. Others touched the fuselage one last time before walking away. The Flying Fortress had carried them through hell, and now it would be dismantled, melted down, forgotten by a world eager to move on. Thousands of B-17s were scrapped in the years immediately after the war. They were cut apart in long rows, their wings stacked like fallen leaves, their aluminum recycled into cars, appliances, even soda cans. To the men who had flown them, it felt like betrayal. "We buried her alive," one veteran said. "She saved our lives and we turned her into beer cans." And yet, not all were lost. A few survived, bought by civilians, preserved by collectors, used for mapping, firefighting, or search and rescue. Some flew for decades after the war, far removed from the smoke and blood of Europe. Each one carried ghosts within its frame, memories trapped in rivets and seams. Over time, a new generation began to rediscover the legend. Filmmakers, historians, and veterans groups restored surviving fortresses, bringing them back to life for air shows and museums. When the engines roared again, old men who had once been young looked to the sky with tears in their eyes. They said the sound brought everything back, the fear, the pride, the brotherhood. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was resurrection. Today, fewer than 50 B-17s remain. Only a handful can still fly. Each one is a time capsule, a living heartbeat of the past. When those four engines thunder to life, the ground trembles, and the air fills with history. Children look up in wonder, not realizing that they're hearing the same sound that once echoed over Berlin, over Normandy, over the burning fields of war. The Flying Fortress became a monument to resilience, not because it was perfect, but because it endured imperfection. It flew damaged. It fought broken. It returned home half destroyed. And that, more than any bomb it dropped, was its message to the world. You don't need to be flawless to survive. You just need to keep flying. Long after the last guns fell silent, the legend of the Flying Fortress continued to echo through time. What had once been an instrument of war had become a monument to endurance. To stand before one today is to stand before the memory of every man who climbed into its freezing belly and dared to challenge the sky. The paint may have faded, the metal may have dulled, but its spirit remains untouched. In airfields and museums around the world you can still see them, the survivors. Their bodies are scarred, their rivets weathered, but their presence commands silence. Step close, and you can still smell the faint trace of oil and iron. You can still see the bullet holes, the patches welded decades ago by hands that are now gone. Inside, the narrow passages and tiny gun stations speak of the men who lived here for hours that felt like lifetimes. You can almost hear the engines start again, feel the vibration under your feet, the tremor of a world at war. For the men who flew them, the B-17 was more than a machine. It was memory-made metal. Many veterans could never fully explain what the aircraft meant to them. Some said it was luck, others called it loyalty. But when they looked at a fortress, they saw their youth, their courage, and their fear reflected back at them. They saw the friends who never made it home. The fortresses that returned were not just aircraft, they were witnesses. Witnesses to courage, to loss, to the price of survival. One veteran once said, "We didn't win because we were the best. We won because we refused to stop." That same sentence could have been written on the B-17's wings. Every dent, every scar, every patch of worn metal told that story. The story of refusing to stop. In the years after the war, when the world tried to forget the noise of bombers and guns, the few surviving fortresses became symbols of remembrance. In air shows, they drew crowds of thousands. The deep, resonant rumble of their four engines stirred something primal in the listeners, something between awe and reverence. For those who knew, that sound wasn't just nostalgia. It was the voice of endurance itself. There is something almost spiritual about the way the B-17 refuses to fade. It shouldn't have survived. Machines like it belong to another century, to another kind of world. And yet, every time a restored fortress takes off, it defies time once again. Watching one lift into the air today feels like watching history breathe. It's a reminder that what we build with courage can outlast the very hands that shaped it. The fortress teaches us something profound about humanity. We are fragile and yet we endure. We break and yet we rebuild. Like the B-17 we fly on despite our scars. In every person who has ever faced despair and still found the strength to rise, there is a piece of that same spirit, the spirit of the plane that refused to die. The pilots of the Flying Fortress often said that their aircraft had a soul. They felt it in the way it carried them through storms and fire, in the way it absorbed punishment and still found its way home. That feeling isn't easily explained, but it resonates with anyone who's ever survived something they shouldn't have. You don't forget the thing that saved your life. When historians write about war, they write about numbers, planes built, bombs dropped, enemies destroyed. But the story of the Flying Fortress is different. It's not a story of destruction. It's a story of resistance. It's the story of what happens when men and machines refuse to surrender to fate. It's the story of survival, not just in war, but in every struggle where the odds are against you. There were over 12,000 B-17s built during the war. Today, fewer than 10 can still fly. But even if the last one were to fall silent, the fortress would not truly die. Because the idea it represents, the refusal to give up, lives on in every act of endurance, in every quiet victory, in every moment when someone keeps going despite the odds. Think of what that means. A machine designed for war has become a lesson for peace. A symbol once feared has become one admired. Time has stripped it of its violence and left only its courage. And perhaps that's what redemption looks like. Not forgetting what something was, but seeing what it became. In many ways, the Flying Fortress is a mirror of the human condition. We are built to withstand, to keep moving forward, even when the engines fail and the wings are torn. We are capable of breaking beyond repair, and yet somehow we still fly. Every one of us, in our own way, is a fortress fighting gravity, refusing to fall. Walk through a B-17's narrow fuselage, and you understand something about the men who flew it. You see where the gunners knelt, where the navigator traced invisible lines across the sky, where the pilot's hands trembled on the yoke as flak burst outside the windows. You see how small it really was, how close death truly stood, and you realize that courage isn't loud or heroic. It's quiet. It's the steady heartbeat inside chaos. Even after the war, the Flying Fortress kept serving. Some became rescue planes, others weather monitors or firefighting aircraft. The same design that survived combat adapted to saving lives. It was as if the aircraft, once an instrument of destruction, had been reborn with a new purpose. It had fought enough. Now it would protect. But the most powerful legacy of the B-17 isn't found in museums or films. It's found in stories passed down through generations. Grandfathers telling grandchildren about the missions they flew. Mechanics remembering the sound of engines roaring to life at dawn. Families learning that their existence was owed to a metal machine that made it home against all odds. The fortress didn't just carry bombs, it carried hope. And hope, unlike machinery, never rusts. The phrase, "the plane that refused to die," isn't just a title, it's truth. In every decade since its creation, the B-17 has found a way to survive. Through wars, through obsolescence, through time itself. Even when humanity moved on to supersonic jets and spaceflight, the old fortress remained, slower, older, but unbroken. The world changed, but she didn't need to. She had already proved everything that mattered. And now, as we stand in an age of technology and distraction, there's something timeless about looking up and seeing that shape in the sky. It reminds us of a time when courage was tangible, when survival was earned one heartbeat at a time, and when every man in the air knew the value of coming home. The lesson the Flying Fortress gives us is simple, but eternal. It's not the machine that defines the spirit. It's the will behind it. That same will is what drives us to push through our own battles, to rebuild when we're broken, to keep flying when the world tells us we can't. Because in the end, the B-17 story isn't about war at all. It's about endurance. It's about the part of us that refuses to surrender, even when everything around us is burning. It's about that quiet, unstoppable part of the human heart that says, "Not yet, not today." And maybe that's why we still look at the fortress with awe. It's not nostalgia. It's recognition. We see ourselves in it. We see the fighter, the survivor, the soul that keeps going. The Flying Fortress may have been made of aluminum and fire, but what it carried was something far greater. The proof that persistence can outlast destruction. The proof that even in the darkest sky, something can still rise. It's the same truth that carries through history. Through people, through time itself, you can break the body, but you can't kill the will. When the last flying fortress leaves the ground one final time, when its engines echo for the last time across an open sky, the sound will not fade, it will transform. It will become the whisper of every survivor, every fighter, every person who ever refused to give up. The fortress will always fly because what it represents can never fall. The B-17 was more than an airplane. It was a heartbeat made of metal. It was fear and faith, loss and triumph, destruction and redemption, all in one machine. It carried the best and worst of humanity into the sky. And somehow it came back with only the best. And now, its story belongs to us. The next time you face something that feels impossible, when life tears through you like flak, when the weight of the world feels too much to bear, remember the flying fortress. Remember the plane that kept flying with its wings torn and its engines failing. Remember that even a broken thing can still soar, because the real message of the B-17 is not about war. It's about life. It's about finding the strength to rise again and again. No matter how many times you're hit, the flying fortress refused to die, and so can you. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength that lives inside every one of us, join us. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this journey through history's most powerful stories. Because the past isn't gone, it's alive, and it has something left to teach us. The sky may be quieter now, but somewhere above the clouds, the echo of the flying fortress still lingers. It's the sound of endurance, the sound of courage, the sound of life refusing to end. And as long as we remember it, the plane that refused to die will keep flying.